Would anyone like to read all of the first part of the Olivet Discourse again?
All of it?
Just to verse 35.
35? I'll give it a shot. Starting at the beginning of 24.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of age?" And Jesus answered them, "Take heed that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the sufferings. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get a coat. And alas, for those who are with child, for those who are nursing in those days, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Then, if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Behold, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Behold, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation, those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of the earth, one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Okay, good.
That's 35.
Thank you. So we were in discussing the Olivet Discourse. We had gotten up to verse 21.
Oh, 21. Okay.
Right, we had finished. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So all of the warnings to immediately flee from Jerusalem, because there was imminent danger, and if you delayed, you might not be able to get out. Incidentally, there's one more comment about woe to, and alas, for those who are with child and for those who are nursing in those days. Theophylact of Orid had a comment on those nursing in those days. If you stay in Jerusalem, your child is quite possibly could be eaten. Cannibalism that broke out in the city during the Roman siege. So very, very gruesome, and a very, very imminent warning, huge danger to disregard Jesus' warnings. And for there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world till now, no, and never will be. What does that refer to? And so what does this whole section refer to?
Great Tribulation.
Yeah, what is the Great Tribulation?
Events preceding the coming of Christ, or second coming, right?
The destruction of the temple.
Yeah, the destruction of the temple. If the just at a fairly logical level, for there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be, implies that there can be a great tribulation after this tribulation. But the second coming, in some sense, the end of tribulation, right? After the second coming, God wipes away every tear. There's a new heaven and a new earth. So it doesn't, so just on the basis, logically, that doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But Great Tribulation picks up on the theme of tribulation in verse 9, right? For they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. So what this is a very common tendency in apocalyptic literature, and one that frequently interpreters of apocalyptic literature completely miss, is that there's repetition or amplification. So, for example, Revelation, there are it starts with like the seven, I think there's like the seven trumpet judgments, and then those are followed by the seven bowl judgments or something. I may be, getting things out of order. But the point is, interpreters tend to see these as consecutive events, or consecutive periods, when in fact it's really the same period viewed from multiple points of view. So one point of view is from earth, the other is from heaven. And so this is what we have again here. We have a amplification of some of the signs, right? So signs for the destruction of the temple. Sign one was false messiahs. Sign two, wars and rumors of war. Sign three, famines. Four, earthquakes. Five, persecution. Six, apostasy. Seven, the gospel preached worldwide. And then the abomination of desolation. So now Jesus is returning to the signs and to things to be particularly that he particularly wanted to amplify. And the first of those is tribulation. And he uses tribulation, the Greek word thlipsis, in both places.
Mhm. So what does it mean by it not being shortened? It was short.
Well, it means that if the period had continued, then far more life would have been lost, and the church would have been destroyed. So what he focuses on here in this portion of the dialogue is he focuses on the Great Tribulation. We identified that earlier as the persecution of the church, especially as it moves from persecution from Judaism to empire-wide persecution by Nero. So the Neronian persecution was abated when the revolt in Jerusalem happened, and Nero's attention was diverted to Jerusalem, and then it was completely ended when Nero committed suicide. So had that happened and it continued, it's quite possible that the church could have been eliminated. So he warns, so he amplifies the remarks about the Great Tribulation. Then in verse 23 to false messiahs. And then comes cosmic symbolism in verse 29. So those are all really amplifications.
So if the sun is darkened, is that the three days of darkness?
No, it's symbolism.
Okay. People are really getting us confused.
I mean, it's sort of really important to, kind of look at the Olivet Discourse carefully and look at the book of Revelation carefully. And so the entire Olivet Discourse, So remember, the disciples asked two questions. When will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age? And so if we look at Jesus' response, he clearly differentiates, separates the time of when will this being the destruction of the temple and the stone being left unturned from the second coming.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably, there can be and there has been a long period of time between those two. In fact, there still may be thousands of years before the second coming, as far as we know, or there may not be.
Mm.
So all of these things that he's talking about here apply to the no stone being unturned. Everything applies to the destruction of the temple. He turns to the question of is the second coming only in verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So what is he saying? There will be no signs. There won't be anything. It will happen, and it will be very obvious, and everyone will know that there are no signs. So the problem is, when the church traditionally is referred to this kind of looking for the signs and reading the signs for the second coming as idle speculation, because it typically is accompanied by really ultimately various forms of sinfulness. So the first sinfulness is that we're coming because Christ is coming because others are so sinful. But when we're looking at others being sinful, we most commonly should be looking at in the mirror at ourselves, because we're typically being still more sinful. So that's a problem. The tendency to look for signs is also accompanied by sometimes doing what you think needs to be done to make the signs happen, right? So, for example, it says the gospel will be preached worldwide or throughout the whole world. And saw the word for that world is oikum, which means a civilized world. So the gospel will be preached throughout the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Doesn't mean preached throughout the world. That's a misunderstanding and a bad translation. So there's this misunderstanding that there's this focus on evangelizing throughout the world so that Jesus can come, right? But that's a complete misunderstanding. And then also, people have been often very specific in, designating the timetable, as in Jesus is going to be coming tomorrow. And so, people begin to sell things and rid of stuff and act as if Jesus is coming tomorrow. And of course, Jesus doesn't come tomorrow. So it's a major diversion. The message is that we're to live our lives as if Jesus is to come today or at any moment. Or to put it another way, nothing should change the fact that Jesus comes or doesn't come. We should remain disciples.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we begin to misunderstand and misinterpret the Olivet Discourse, I think, we do considerable harm to the gospel. So once we finish going through this first half, what I want to do is go back again to sort of look at the Olivet Discourse within the broader context of Matthew's gospel. Because we've seen that Matthew's gospel is very carefully organized, right, and is very coherent and very cohesive. He just doesn't kind of have sort of this free form flow of consciousness kind of thing. So,
But that's all. But that's the part of the days of the sun will be darkened. That's all under the coming of the Son of Man. That's all that section.
right.
So that may not have happened yet.
Oh, it's happened. It's happened.
It has happened?
It's happened, yeah.
Okay.
Where is the Son of Man coming?
Back to Earth?
No.
When he's coming, no one knows.
No, that's a different issue. There are two comings.
Mm-hmm.
So when he came after being resurrected?
No, it's Daniel. We'll look at it in detail when we get there.
Okay.
Well, where he's coming, or to put it another way, he's being presented before the Son of Man, before the Ancient of Days.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
The Father.
So in Christian terminology,
God the Father.
He what?
God the Father.
Yeah.
The Ancient of Days.
Right, but in Christian terminology, he's taking his place at the right hand of God.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
and that was after his resurrection.
Yeah, but the big thing about it is that it's a sign of vindication, and it is in Daniel, and so that's what it means within the context of the Olivet Discourse. So the church is being persecuted. The church is on the verge of annihilation. The temple is destroyed as an act of judgment. And so Jesus is vindicated as the Son of God. So that's fundamentally what that means.
Okay.
The coming is not to earth. And I don't remember the Greek word used coming there, but it's not parousia, which is the word used for coming elsewhere. So when the disciples asked, "What is the sign of your coming?" the Greek word used is parousia. And then in verse 27, where Jesus says, "For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the be the coming of the Son of Man." Their coming is again parousia, and then coming is again used starting in verse 30. Parousia is again used starting in verse 37. Given that Matthew's gospel is very carefully organized, if we were to see the early parts of verse 20 of chapter 24 as related to the second coming, we have what's really this huge non sequitur that, out of that Jesus pronounces judgment, pronounces his woes upon Jerusalem, pronounces judgment. And then suddenly we have this leap into the second coming, which makes absolutely no sense. That's like a non sequitur. So, why would Matthew have this free flow of consciousness when there's been no previous free flow of consciousness? For there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world till now, no, and never will be. Has that been fulfilled? Is what Jesus is describing the greatest tribulation that has ever happened.
Isn't that a destruction of the temple?
Right. It's a destruction of the temple tribulation that has ever, and the period before the destruction of the temple. Is that the greatest tribulation that has ever happened?
And that was how many years after his death? 47 or something.
Depends on when you date his death.
Yeah.
So the destruction of, if he died in 30, then it was 40. If he died in 33, then it was 37. So is that the greatest tribulation in the history of the world?
Well, I think it's been continuous tribulation, hasn't it? Over many years.
In terms of what, I mean, what year?
Even up until now, I mean, we're always in the middle of tribulation. There's been wars, there's been.
Yeah, but
No, ever will be. You see, looking at that verse, it says, verse 21, for at that time there will be a great tribulation such as has never been since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. So
right,
it means there will be no other that rival that tribulation.
right, right. So nothing will rival that tribulation.
Okay.
So is that true?
No one, I don't know if I know enough about the history of the world to say that. I know they had like people killing each other, like and eating each other, which is pretty. I don't know. I don't know if that happens any other time in the history of the world, no?
Well, it probably has, and I mean, certainly the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews, and World War II, particularly in 25 million Russians were killed during World War II. Enormous carnage out of every Soviets. So, in pure body count, that's certainly not true. But it's really not an issue of um, of body count or sort of the number of deaths or the extent of the suffering. The question is the tribulation. What Jesus is saying is that the Great Tribulation can alter human history. The Great Tribulation can can destroy God's plan for salvation history, which makes it, the greatest suffering. So it becomes potentially a defeat of God's plan. That makes sense.
Yeah. Can you also shed more light on verse 22, where it says, if those days had not been shortened, no one will be saved, but for the sake of the elect, they will be shortened.
So what we have, so Jesus right here is warning of the tribulation, and he's about to warn of false messiahs. He had given the signs for the abomination of desolation and from Judea. So there are two things that he's really focusing on here. First, the tribulation includes the persecution of the church. So the church is being persecuted as Jewish Christians are being persecuted by non-Jewish Christians. And then the church is being persecuted on an empire-wide basis by Nero and by the Roman state. So remember at this point, although the gospel has spread, as Paul says, to the civilized world, the number of Christians is small. They're still predominantly Jewish, and they're still predominantly concentrated in Jerusalem, which is really, Jerusalem is the major center of Christianity. That means that it's very easy to destroy the church. So how do we periodize salvation history? We have the old covenant, right, which gives way to the covenant. The new covenant is reflected in the church. If the church is destroyed, then the new covenant is destroyed. If the church is destroyed, there's no new covenant, or there's no bearing of the new covenant, which therefore defeats God's plan of salvation history. So the viewpoint here is on salvation history rather than general history, and at the danger to the church. So we have the persecution, and then followed by of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. So if they stay in Jerusalem, right, they die. So the persecution was shortened by, first of all, the outbreak of the Roman-Jewish War, which diverted Nero's attention, and then by Nero's suicide. And then the siege of Jerusalem, rather being protracted, lasted only 5 months between the time that General Titus surrounded the city and General Titus entered the city and destroyed the temple and most of the city itself. And is having recognized the signs according to church tradition, Jewish Christians had left the city and had fled to Pella. So if we look at it not so much as a body count or sort of a horrible catastrophe, but as potentially what?
Disbursement?
Well, as potentially a defeat of God's plan, as potentially a derailment of salvation history, then is the greatest tribulation that, if it had not been shortened, would have destroyed the church.
I have a question. Was Nero the one that St. Paul was put to death under? Nero was in power? Okay.
Nero is also, he presumably fiddled while Rome burned, right? And the evidence suggests he started the fire himself. He was, a maniac and a madman. Incidentally, the not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be, also comes from Daniel. Comes from Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, if we want to take a quick look. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found written in the book. So it's a very close bar from Daniel. Daniel's prophecy refers to the desecration of the temple under Antiochus, which Daniel is told is experienced up to that point. And so Jesus is saying that this tribulation will be worse than the one under Antiochus. And so again, the mention that this is such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. The again implies a possibility of greater suffering, even if Jesus is ruling it out. So that clearly doesn't characterize the second coming, unless we want to see the second coming as a period of great suffering, which it's not.
Ron,
Uh-huh.
I'm still not understanding how Jesus did it, like how it's a big tribulation because God's plan was defeated. I still can't.
Could have been defeated,
Cool. Okay.
not was defeated.
Oh, okay. That was like that's I was like that's no. Okay, could have been defeated. Okay, that makes more sense.
So the tribulation then is a reference to Nero's persecution, to the Roman Jewish war, and to the fall of the temple. And so the days are shortened. Notice he says, for the sake of elect, the days will be shortened, or for the sake of the chosen. So who typically is the elect? Who are the chosen?
The Israelites?
The Israelites, right? So in the context of the Olivet Discourse, who are the chosen or the elect?
The Christians.
Jesus' disciples.
Mm-hmm.
So that's significant. God's promises flow from Israelites to the remnant that remains faithful to God, who are Jesus' disciples. And then in verse 23 through 26, we have a repetition or amplification of the warning about false messiahs and false prophets.
So if there's so many false prophets and we're not supposed to believe in it, well, believe in any of them, then I know you said that it will be obvious when he does come.
Uh-huh.
So it'll be much more glorious than any of these instances.
He's talking about false prophets and
Right.
the coming of and the destruction of the temple. You know, when there was an abundance of messianic pretenders and false prophets, but more generally, I mean, prophecy, so-called biblical prophecy about the end times is always a bunch of hogwash. Prophecy is meaningful, in some contexts. I mean, as when, so, when you pray for somebody in front of them, sometimes you function as a prophet, so you speak God's word into their life. Um, you can function as a prophet in terms of calling people, groups of people, the church of as a whole to, its moral responsibility or something like that. I mean, that's a genuine prophetic role, and one that's needed. And you can argue, for example, that the Holy Father's encyclical on climate change fills the role of prophet. What a prophet does not do in the current circumstances in the under the new covenant, just prophesy about the second coming, because there's nothing to prophesy about. There are no signs. So if you're prophesying about things or when it's going to happen, you're missing the point and being a false prophet. The important point is that that we're to imitate Christ in our lives each day. The church is to imitate Christ in its corporate life each day. And then Christ will come when Christ comes. It doesn't matter whether Christ comes in 10,000 years or later this evening, if we are doing what we're supposed to do. And if we're not doing what we're supposed to do, and we need, information about when he's coming to help us,
Get ready.
get on board, then what are we doing?
Or prophecy.
Then
Yeah.
then it becomes, if we individually, it means that we're perfectly comfortable misrepresenting Christ in our lives until we decide we had better get serious about saving ourselves. So it's kind of like a rat abandoning a sinking ship, right? And so, that quite frankly is sinful. Look out for number one attitude. And if as a church corporately, we decide, well, I mean, we've been lax, but now it's time for the church to get serious about this second thing. What can that even mean? It just doesn't work that way. So all of this nonsense about prophecies of the second coming is, it's nonsense. It's not what Christ calls us to do. We don't know the day or the hour. We'll never know the day or the hour until it arrives, and that's just fine. That's the way it's supposed to be. There's a reason for that. So the false messiahs, Josephus actually records signs performed by pretenders that included the parting of the Jordan, uncovering Moses' sacred vessels, assorted God-given signs of freedom, and sort of conspicuous signs and wonders performed by, various messianic pretenders and false prophets. So, that clearly happened in the period before the destruction of the temple and the um, destruction of Jerusalem. So then he says, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered. What is for as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man mean? Why is that there?
It can happen so quickly.
My Bible says, my Bible says what? It's gonna be spontaneous. That's like on the bottom of my Bible.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and lightning is just a flash.
So look at it in its context. So behold, he is in the wilderness. Behold, he is in the inner rooms. So the wilderness is at least, a place where a prophet or perhaps the Messiah might be, as in, John the Baptist was out in the desert. Behold, he is in the inner room, sort of hidden. But so we have, these messianic pretenders who are kind of local, right?
Mhm.
They're sort of there. They're not even very obviously there. If they're in the inner rooms, they're fairly well hidden. And so the four is, kind of an opposite. So whereas, these messiahs are local or are hidden or are, claiming to be messiah, but they're not very public. You have to go to them and you have to search them out. The reality is that, and here in this coming, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Parousia is used as the noun. This is the second coming, saying that unlike these other pretenders who claim to be Messiah, who you have to go and seek out, when the second coming does come, it will be very public. You will notice it. Everyone will notice it. It will be obvious to all. You're not going to have to go and seek out anything, or you're not going to have to go and investigate,
Find anything.
or
Yeah.
you're not going to have to find anything because it's going to be obvious. And then with this kind of this um, parenthetical, he then returns the destruction of the temple and says, wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered. So we go back to the abomination. The body is the temple and the Jewish religious establishment, and the eagles are the Roman army.
Mhm.
So in terms of, remember, the tribulation of those days and the days being shortened, we tend to underestimate um, for Judaism, the pain of the destruction of the temple. It was an earth-shattering event that really led to a, sort of profound questioning about where Judaism should going and what was left of Judaism, and it took some time, a century and a half, for the evolution of rabbinic Judaism and Judaism as an ethical system. From the viewpoint of a Jew living in Jesus' time, the temple is the center of Judaism. The temple is where God lives. God is present in the temple. The religion is based, Judaism is based on sacrifice to Yahweh. That can only be done at the temple. So the temple is the center of faith. It's the center of where God is. Without the temple, without the temple, Yahweh becomes irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no God. Can that be? So
Christ has replaced it.
But the thing is that that divide is an extremely painful one, and that divide is central to salvation history. So Jesus isn't saying this will be the most gruesome in the history of the world, or this will be the most deaths or anything. He's saying that from the viewpoint of salvation history, this will be the most painful divide. Never compare to this, which is true. Nothing could, since we're living in the last period of history, nothing ever will, even though individual periods certainly had much higher body counts, greater brutality, and all sorts of things, but they haven't threatened to derail salvation history, and they haven't marked as sharp a divide in salvation history.
Now makes sense. Because if you wait for, like you said, body count, I think there are like more.
Yeah.
There are like tragedies that impact more the history of humanity than that. But
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about salvation,
Right.
I don't think there was any shaking in their religion like that one.
Right. Right. Yeah. Also, remember I haven't explained this. So the temple is in some sense seen as a microcosm of the promised land, which in turn was a microcosm of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so the destruction of the temple means in some sense that the entire world has been shaken.
Okay, so I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
If the Vatican, if St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, if that was destructed, would that be just as much of an impact?
No,
That wouldn't be the same
not the
to the
same.
Christian world?
I mean, that's
To the
not to say.
Christian world. You're talking about the Jewish world, the temple. But for Christianity,
No, not at all. No, nothing comparable. I mean, the Vatican is, a sacred place, but its destruction doesn't mean the end of the church. It means the end of a building, however much we,
Mhm.
Revere that building and revere the Vatican and whatever. It nevertheless is only a building and a place.
It's
But
actually an entity in itself, isn't it? Isn't it like a country?
yeah,
I mean, it's a sovereignty.
yeah, is, but nevertheless, it's not at all comparable. But so if the Vatican is destroyed, the Church presumably continues,
Mm.
right? But here, there's nothing to continue
Hmm.
because this is it. The temple's gone. I mean, it's if
Because of the size of the world at that time. I mean, as
well,
far
no,
as
because
the
there's
Jews
nothing
were
else.
concerned. Yeah,
The temple is it's
Yeah.
it's
that was it.
it's sort of like if the Vatican is all of us will still be Catholics,
Yeah.
right? And we can still go to church somewhere and
Mhm.
worship. But here there's nothing.
Mm.
The temple's gone. The temple is it. And
Yeah.
there are synagogues, but those serve a very, sort of different purpose. The temple is where you
Everything
worship.
started, right? Everything started
It's
there.
more than that. The temple is where you sacrifice, where sins are forgiven.
Okay.
Your sins can't be forgiven if you don't sacrifice to God. And with no temple, there's nothing to sacrifice. And you just can't up and build a new one. So there's no temple. That's the end of the whole thing. So, and then the temple is where God is. And I mean, God isn't in the Vatican or he's in the Vatican to the extent that he's everywhere, but
Mhm.
there's no special presence of God in the Vatican or in St. Peter's. We can't say that God lives there. And so St. Peter's, which almost none of us do, we're seeing God directly. We can't. That's not the Catholic view, but here the temple, is where God is.
Mhm.
God is in the Holy of Holies,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
right? That's gone. Where God? What happened to God? God is gone. That's a
Although Moses did set up an altar here, and I mean, people have set up altars where they are.
yeah, but those were considered the. I mean, Moses set up the tabernacle,
Yeah.
which sort of morphed into the temple. So there was the
Okay.
tabernacle, and then there's the tabernacle at Shiloh, which was Moses' tabernacle or the descendant
Mhm.
of Moses' tabernacle, and then Solomon's temple was built. But then the um, the there was under the as the temple priests consolidated their power, there was a major attempt to get rid of sort of local temples that were typically seen as churches, although it's not clear that all of them were. Some of them were also simply local, you know, people building temples to Yahweh. But that was seen as unacceptable. They were all lumped together in the category of the high places and thought to be idolatrous.
Mm.
So
Mm.
by the time of by around the return from Babylon, I think most of that sort of decentralization was gone, and the
Mm.
temple was
Back to
the
central.
place.
Yeah.
And so its destruction is really the end of an age. It's not merely that a building is gone, or it's that God appears to be dead. If you're Jewish, I
Mhm.
mean, where is God?
Mhm.
Um, and so a major painful and
So Ron, the Jewish like religion that we see today comes from those people, right? The ones like before Christ time.
Rabbi,
Of
um,
that time. Of that time.
of that time. Um, so a prominent rabbi in that early period was Paul's teacher, Gamaliel, and his major opponent was Hillel. So they were very important. But so that the so in terms of Judaism, there was a migration, or the center of Judaism moved from the temple to the synagogue. The and then the Mishnah was sort of gradually formulated, so that in the third century it sort of came together. Um, but and Judaism became, well, so we began to see some of the divides that we see in contemporary Judaism today. Like in large part, Judaism became an ethical religion, so a religion of ethics and of morality, with a question of what is the relationship of Judaism to the law. So obviously, with the sacrificial system gone, a part of the Mosaic law necessarily has to fall out. But then the question is, what about the rest of the law? So what about the dietary? What about the purity laws? What about sort of all of those other things? And so we begin to see the divide between what are today Orthodox Jews who keep the law very rigorously, except for the law on sacrifice, or the portions of the Mosaic law regarding sacrifice. The conservative Jews who keep the law, Mosaic law, except for the sacrificial laws, fairly rigorously, but not quite as the Orthodox Jews, and liberal Jews who tend to discard much of the Mosaic law and see Judaism predominantly as an ethical and a moral guide, uh, ethical and a moral religion. But that's that's that involved a major evolution and major after the destruction of the temple. It wasn't an immediate process.
Yeah, I was just wondering how they survived, huh? In terms of religion, because
Right.
like the temple was destroyed, and then like God is gone, and then like how we have
The
Jewish
the
to this day.
Judaism was, sort of helped consider. I mean, the partly, there were a large number of Jews in diaspora who, outside of Jerusalem, outside of the Holy Land, um, you know, some of whom presumably had probably never been to the temple, even though one is, supposed to go annually. Nevertheless,
Make a pilgrimage, yeah.
yeah, but probably many did not. Um, so, I mean, there are Jews in the diaspora, and then there's also, the history of Judaism, where the northern kingdom was overrun by the Assyrians, and everybody was deported, and then the uh, Judah was overrun by the Babylonians, and the temple was destroyed then. And so there was a period with no temple until uh, it was rebuilt, and Darius, the Persian king, Jews to return to the Holy Land. So there was a history, and well, I mean, in our own day, there was the Holocaust. So there's a certain element of hope that is intrinsic to Judaism, a certain belief in that there's a better tomorrow, and that somehow, however bleak and however absent God appears to be in the current circumstance, God is nevertheless present and will rescue his people. And so we see that in the Seder. The Seder begins with the youngest person in present asking the question, how is this day unlike every other day? And the important thing about that, how is this day, is that the person is asking about today. And today is that the same day that, 2,000 years, more than 2,000, however many, 4,000 or so, 5,000 years ago, that Moses led his people out of bondage in Egypt. So that same day, that day is made present again. So that same day is happening once again now. It's a day of hope and a day of liberation. And then at the end of the Seder, after the final cup of wine, the closing is, I'll see you next year in Jerusalem. So God's people will return to the holy city once more. So, it's a consistent message of hope, so that despite, however bad things are, and that same hope, allowed Jews to survive the Holocaust, those who were able to, and also, has allowed Jews to survive, really intensive anti-Semitism, from the whole period uh, from the whole period the Jews were in the diaspora until today. So, so there's this really strong element of hope, despite, in the face of apparent bleakness and hopelessness. So that element of hope is really very important.
Makes sense. Thank you, bro.
Mm-hmm. So we're out of time, and we'll pick up next week. We're not actually. I think that's probably good that we're going slowly. All of that discourse is really important. Really important that we understand it, and especially given that all of the sort of misinformed interpretation that circulates. So we'll start with next week with. I need to get my eyes examined. We'll start next week with verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days and the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light. These are big second coming verses, but they're actually not about the second coming at all.
Okay. That's real clear.
The immediately should be a dead giveaway, and if it's not, then later, then the later thing, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place, should be the ultimate dead giveaway.
Okay.
Because all of these things evidently have taken place, or Jesus is a false prophet. And if Jesus is a false prophet, he obviously is not the Son of God. And if Jesus is a false prophet and is not the Son of God, then we're really engaging in idolatry.
Oh no.
But since we're not engaging in idolatry, and since Jesus is a false prophet, and since Jesus is the Son of God, then we know that all of these things have indeed taken place within his generation, or the generation of those listening to him.